Our presentation is called simply Anubis. So, in the beginning, the golden jackals circled around the graves of the dead, digging them up by night to feast upon them. These North African scavengers were both the protectors and the devourers of those who had died, and so too was the patron deity of all jackals, a god called Wepwawet, a jackal who guarded the west and the dead. For the pre-dynastic Egyptians living along the Nile Valley between 6000 and 3150 BCE, who better to guard the dead than another canine? For if the canines who took from the dead, and so naturally their protector would be of the same kind. So therefore Wepwawet kept the scavengers away who bore his likeness, and he was the oldest and the original jackal god of the Nile River Valley. By the first dynasty of the Egyptian pharaohs, Wepwawet either merged with or became the brother of, or in general syncretized with, a new god who was referred to as Anpu or Inpu. And the name we usually know him by, Anubis, is actually the Greek translation of this older Egyptian name. In Egyptian, the name in might have referred to either a royal child, or it might also have referred to decay, as in the decaying of a human body. The earliest imagery of Anpu or Inpu is of a full-bodied jackal, like the ones that I showed or the one in this picture here. As time went on, we start seeing the other image of him, which was a man with the head of a jackal, but it was always that same black jackal imagery throughout. And this image was frequently seen on the tombs of even the earliest Egyptian pharaohs, going all the way back to 3150 BCE. And to this god fell the task of minding and guarding the dead. He was the guardian of the dead. They called him the first of the Westerners because they believed that the dead traveled to the west, and so therefore, as the king of the dead, he was somewhere to the west. And those images were a way of calling upon him to guard the dead. And the syncretism that occurred several thousand years ago between Inpu and Wepwawet is just one of many transformations that this god undergoes throughout time. We'll talk about some of those a little bit later on. But during this period of the first dynasty, when his primary job was the protector and ruler of the dead. That began with the process of mummification, funerals, and up until Osiris became the god of the dead, that was his primary job. Oops. There we go. So, yeah. So he really didn't change a whole lot, especially throughout time. He's always been in charge of mummies and curses and looking after the dead. So, within the pantheon, who was he? Where did he come from? What was his family? Well, as you can imagine, over the course of several thousand, 3,000 or 4,000 years, the story evolved somewhat. in the early pharaonic era, Ra was seen as the primary deity, and Anubis was considered to be the son of Ra and Hathor. But by the Middle Kingdom, around 2890 BCE, Osiris started to become the primary deity of the Egyptians, and so his family changed, and he was considered to be the son of Osiris and his sister Nephthys. And I'll show you, and according to this story, Nephthys, Set, and Osiris and Isis were all siblings. Osiris was the ruler, and he was married to Isis, and Nephthys and Set were married to each other. But Nephthys wanted to get it on with Osiris. So they slept together, and Anubis was the result of this union. However, shortly after he was born, she abandoned him. Isis found him, and she raised him. So he had kind of an interesting backstory when they tried to write him into the Osirian pantheon. And so we'll get into more of the story later on, but Osiris eventually became the god of the dead, and so he supplanted Anubis in that role. But Anubis was so popular and so ingrained as a god of the dead that even though there was sort of a new god of the dead, they had to find another job for him related to the dead. So this is where he really started to become known as the god of mummification. He was a protector of the dead, and he oversaw the journey that the Egyptians took into the afterlife. He also had a daughter who was called Kebhet. If I'm mispronouncing these names, I apologize. Like her father, she was seen as a caretaker of the dead. Her father, her grandfather, they ruled, they judged, they did all the serious work, but it's an administrative process. It takes a long time for all the dead to wait in line, get their heart weighed, see if they're going to be eaten by Amet. So they're standing there, and so what are you going to do? Well, you might get thirsty, you might get hungry. So she would go up and down the line of the dead, giving water, kind of taking care of them, making sure that their needs were met while they waited in line to have the ceremonies take place once they died. And I just find it kind of interesting that there's specifically a goddess whose job it is to look after the people waiting in line in the afterlife, because it really goes to show just how much the Egyptians believed that the afterlife mirrored the everyday. Because if we've ever had to wait in line at like a DMV or something, you know how long and boring and tiring it can get. So wouldn't it be nice if there's a goddess whose job was to like give you water and cookies while you had to sit there and make sure you're comfortable? And so, of course, Anubis, he was very considerate of this problem. So he gave his daughter the job of making sure that everyone was looked after. Right. So the primary role that Anubis played, obviously first was the task of mummification, the physical wrapping of the dead. But then once they were done waiting in line and they got to the scales, now this is where his other job came into play, which was judging and weighing the heart. So according to the Egyptian mythology, if there was a scale, on one end of the scale was a feather, large white feather, usually shown as an ostrich feather of Mut. And on the other side, the dead would place, or Anubis would place their heart of the person who is being judged. And once he sets it down, the scales weigh, and we have to see, is the heart lighter or heavier than the feather? If your heart is lighter, then you ascend to the next stage of the afterlife and your reward. But if your heart is heavier than a feather, then you are immediately consumed by Amit, who you can see depicted in this picture here. He's the crazy looking thing with the crocodile head. And he was usually waiting right under the table or right next to the scales, because if you were judged unworthy, he would immediately leap upon you and consume you. So that's a little bit on the Egyptian afterlife that Anubis works with. And there is one other aspect of Anubis that's very important to understand. He took his job as a protector of the dead very, very seriously. When Isis got all the pieces of Osiris back together, it was Anubis who performed mummification and put him back together. And that was how he was written into the later Egyptian myths as the god of mummification, because he was able to do that for Osiris. There's also this story of when Set tried to stop this from happening. Here we are. So, Anubis saw that Set had taken Osiris's dead body and chopped it into little tiny pieces. He was the protector of the dead, and so any assault upon the dead had to go through him. And so Anubis was absolutely, completely pissed off. And if you ever see a pissed off jackal, you know it's not something you want to mess with. And so Set turned into a leopard, and he was ripping the body apart, and Anubis saw this. So he grabbed his flail that he's often seen holding and a hot branding iron and started beating on the leopard, and that's how the leopard got its spots. Then he flayed off the skin of Set in the leopard form, wrapped it around his body, and he wore it like a tunic, and he wore it from then on. He was often seen wearing a leopard skin. And when his priests would mummify a body, they would wear a jackal-shaped black mask and a leopard skin, as a reminder of this story and what happens to those who mess with the dead on Anubis's watch. All right, so yeah, the main center of worship of Anubis has been lost to time. It was at a city the Greeks called Cyanopolis. There was also one at Hardai. In these temples, dogs were said to roam freely because dogs and jackals were both sacred to Anubis. And it's interesting because he's usually referred to as a jackal, but the ancient Egyptian word for jackal and the word for dog are actually the same word. So it's questionable whether they saw him more as a dog or as a jackal, because there's some argument that could be made that what we think is a jackal head might also be like a Basenji head. It's very similar in shape with the nose and everything, but so it's possible that Basenjis play into him too. And also about those jackals. In 2014, scientists did some genetic testing of the golden jackal, and they found that genetically it's actually closer to a wolf. So they renamed the common term for the species from the golden jackal to the golden wolf. So you technically can have an argument that Anubis is a jackal, he could be a dog, or technically he could be a wolf, depending on how you want to look at it. But obviously, linguistics, mythology, and genetic testing haven't all caught up with each other. So he's still usually referred to as a jackal-headed deity, even if the jackal is really a wolf. As you can see, that jackal is not black. It is golden brown in color. So why was he always shown as black? Well, it was extremely consistent coloring. Wepwawet was black, going all the way back to 3100s BCE, he was black, and that's because it was a symbolic color of fur. Black, to the Egyptian culture, symbolized regeneration, because the black soil of the Nile was literally the force from which life came. So it meant regeneration and life. But in the process of mummification, the bodies turned black. So it was also the color of death. So the color black meant both life and death. So it was a very natural color for Anubis because he represented both death, the process of dying, and also that element of regeneration, that new life that came from the afterlife. And he was an extremely popular Egyptian deity. He'd been worshipped in Egypt by the time the Greeks and the Ptolemy era came about around 350. He'd already been worshipped in Egypt for close to 3,000 years. So there's a tremendous history of Anubis when the Greeks came and started setting up the Greek temples in what had been Egypt. And during this period, there was a lot of syncretism which occurred between the Greek pantheon and the Egyptian pantheon. So a lot of Egyptian gods started being associated with Greek gods and characters. And in Anubis's case, he was syncretized with Hermes. Now, we usually think of Hermes as a messenger god, so it might kind of seem like an interesting choice. But Hermes was also a psychopomp. He escorted the dead to Hades and the underworld, the same way that Anubis was seen as overseeing the judgment and the passage to the underworld. So they kind of put them together, and they came up with a god they called Anubis, who was a syncretized form of both Hermes and Anubis, who started being worshipped in Greece and in Egypt. But there were a few other associations that the Greeks made. Obviously, I mean, he's a canine, so canine in the underworld. Who do we think of? Cerberus. So he was oftentimes associated with Cerberus and also with Orion's dog, Sirius. Possibly because, again, famous dogs in Greek mythology, famous dog, jackal in Egyptian mythology, but also there was in the Odyssey, Odysseus is said to have seen and spoken with Orion the hunter in the underworld while he was traversing it. So, and he was hunting, so I'm guessing they probably assumed that Orion's favorite dog probably followed him there as well. And also, according to Plato at least, Socrates was a fan of swearing by Anubis as well. In a lot of his writings about Socrates, Socrates' favorite oath was by the dog, which the Egyptians used to swear by Anubis. So perhaps inevitably, since he was such a popular and strongly worshipped god for so long, Anubis is one of the Egyptian gods who has made the strongest transition to our modern understanding of who the Egyptians worshipped. His jackal face is one of the most recognizable, and he has served as a villain in many an Egyptian-based movie and video game. Continuing what I will save a rant for another day on the process of turning all the gods of the dead into villains, which is not one bit deserved. But, I mean, black jackal looking thing, I suppose they thought made a good looking villain. And you gotta admit that is a really scary version of Anubis. Right, but there is another modern Anubis who is much closer to the original. How many of you guys have seen American Gods or read American Gods? Yeah. So in Neil Gaiman's American Gods, Mr. Jackal played a role much closer to his original. He ran a funeral parlor along with Mr. Ibis and Bost, and he continued to look after and work with the dead in many very interesting passages of that book. So according to Neil Gaiman, at least, there is some version of Anubis out there in Cairo, Illinois, tending a funeral parlor, looking after the dead, and snacking on hearts. So that's my entire slideshow.